Walking as far as I know.
Thank you for the invitation and thank you for your interest. Actually, I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm happy to be here because I learn a lot from anthropologists. I'm a political scientist and I study not really the intellectuals of the Roma, but those in this paper who speak for the Roma or in name of the Roma. So this paper is not about the Roma, but the pro-Roma actors, how it developed in the last, let's say, 20 years. It is based on a paper that I wrote with my colleague Angela Kocé. And it has three parts. First, I will talk about the emergence of this pro-Roma microcosm, as we call it. Then the controversies, the critiques that you can find in the literature, and finally about the lessons that we can draw. So the emergence, we basically delineated three phases in the emergence of the pro-Roma global civil society. The first phase, the very early one in the 1970s and 80s, was preoccupied with mostly of issues of self-determination, but not exclusively. Probably you have heard of the World Roma Congresses that adopted the Roma flag hymn and the use of the ethnonym Roma. And they also made claim to the recognition of a stateless non-territorial nation. These were the very early moves of an international Roma movement, if we can say that. But the focus shifted gradually in the 1990s to the issues of human rights. And what we are experiencing now from the late 2000s, we agree, is again another shift on social and economic inclusion. Maybe I will not go very much into the details. These are just a bit some of the highlights that maybe you are familiar with, that the first reports were prepared by the big human rights NGOs on the situation of Roma, on police abuse, on different human rights abuses by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. In the mid-1990s, the national human rights NGOs emerged in each country, including Romania, alongside with specialized bodies within international organizations. So it's very interesting that the Roma minority has special bodies inside the Council of Europe, the OSCE, and later the European Union. And we have also founded in 1996 one human rights organization that specifically deals with the human rights violations of Roma, called European Roma Rights Centre. An American NGO was also involved, called Project on Ethnic Relations, that organized big roundtable discussions. But the end of this mushrooming of organizations, a transnational advocacy network emerged, what we call in the literature a transnational advocacy network, which how it worked is very tricky because they couldn't influence directly the governments. So what they did in the phase of the European enlargement is that they used the leverage of the European Union to influence governments. This is the case of Hungary, but it was the same in Romania, Czech Republic, etc., etc. So they wrote human rights, they wrote reports, these NGOs, and then the European Commission, who prepared country reports on how well these candidate countries are doing, they incorporated, sometimes verbatim. They took whole phrases from NGOs, also from other countries, and this is how they indirectly could influence the countries. This is what is sometimes called the boomerang effect in the literature. But what is interesting that this approach focusing on human rights violations faded, and from the late 2000s, the focus is on social and economic inclusion. And what is very interesting that after the Eastern European countries joined the EU, actually the leverage of the European Union decreased in a paradoxical way. So once Hungary, Romania, etc., we are inside the European Union, the EU can do less. It can exert less influence because we are not candidate countries anymore. So that's why a very interesting initiative was launched, the Decade of Roma Inclusion, which is actually quite unique in international politics, because it's also member states, NGOs, international organizations are members, and they join on a voluntary basis. And what it means that basically a country can sign up, that they will fulfill some criteria, they will make action plans. The whole idea was to maintain the political commitments after joining the EU. But if you, I don't know how many of you are interested in these reports, but around 2008, 2009, they already realized that this project basically failed. So you couldn't measure the progress for two reasons. Once, there are no data to measure the progress. Second, if there were sociological researches, I'm more familiar with the Hungarian case, they could detect actually deterioration, increasing segregation, poor, decrease in housing conditions. So I think basically we can say that it failed, and that's why the attention was focusing again on the European Union. And the most influential NGOs working in this field formed the European Roma Policy Coalition in 2008 to exert pressure in the EU for increasing involvement. They had two Roma summits, maybe you have heard of it, 2008-2010. And after the long diplomatic talks, long negotiations, they accepted this year actually something that we call the EU Framework Strategy for Roma Inclusion. So if we summarize what happened, is actually, I don't see the first one. Here it's written EU pre-accession, then Decade of Roma Inclusion, and then EU's Framework Strategy. And these are actually three waves. If you consider the example of Romania or Hungary, these countries actually produce 3 times national strategies to include Roma, to promote the inclusion. These were 3 waves of pressure. They are a bit different because the first and the last one is not voluntary, but it's compulsory. If you want to join the EU, or if you are already a member of the EU, you have to produce something. The decade was compulsory, but I think what is not very clear is how they differ from each other and how the obligations of the state are different in these 3 cases. Maybe you have heard in the news that some of the countries already declared that they don't feel the need to create a new Roma strategy. For example, the Czech Republic declared that they already produced and they have sufficient measures. So it will be a big test whether it will fail or not, this initiative. But this is not the focus of my presentation. I'm mostly concerned with the pro-Roma organizations and NGOs. So this is a very diverse field. I think many of you work actually for NGOs and you know how it works. It's very colorful civil society. There are radicals and moderate service providers, small grassroots and big NGOs, former parties and small civil actors, just like in any other sphere. Like if you consider, for example, the Green Movement, it's very similar. But what is different in the case of Roma is that the NGOs are often labeled gadget or what. So probably you have already confronted, there are quite strong negative feelings about some of the NGOs, and they are labeled as white or hegemonic NGOs. And this was our main concern with my author, to investigate this discourse a bit. They are criticized for the hegemonic human rights discourse, which is downplaying both the local and the macro contexts. They blame the majority prejudice for human rights violations. I don't know about Romania, but in Hungary this discourse clearly backfired. So it was a very strong discourse that we sometimes label liberal discourse, that you blame the majority racism for everything. And this led to the strengthening of the extreme right. So it was I think, one of the main reasons why we had an extreme right party in the parliament and the marches in the villages. They are also criticized for being accountable to the donors and not the Roma communities. If you work in these NGOs, then you know what it means, that you have to align to the priorities of the founder. In most cases, it's the Open Society Institute. Most of these NGOs don't have a membership and volunteers, so they are very different from what would be an association. And they are very removed from the daily struggles of Roma, it's true. Another criticism is that they drain the talented Roma from the field, which is maybe true. I mean, some well-educated and talented Roma, it's true that they work in these NGOs. But our conclusion in the paper is that it's not fair to blame these NGOs for the weakness of Romani grassroots mobilization. There are other causes. One cause is very simple, it's historical. So if you consider to organize in a way what we call a civic association. It was never part of the Roma, how to say, history or culture, so they were pushed historically in different forms to the margins of society. And this historical disadvantage just cannot disappear in a couple of years or even decades. It's a slow process, and in this respect I think it's useful to compare it to the Afro-American experience. There are also organizational failures that you may be aware of, that some of the Roma and pro-Roma organizations lack transparency, they have poor internal democracy, and they have a hierarchical and rigid structure. And what I call socio-psychological, or what we could call, here I basically refer often to the anthropological literature, is that yes, it's very difficult to move on a, let's call, pan-Roma identity, when it's, yes, in some cases it's weak, or you can say that there are big tensions and frictions between different communities, that what we may call Roma. And also, in most cases, it is a stigma that cannot serve as the source of organization. So what are the conclusions? This pro-Roma civil society has a mixed record. They successfully drew attention to the plight of Roma, but it's true that despite all efforts, the living conditions didn't improve significantly. Another lesson is that solidarity can easily turn into hegemony. A very thin layer of transnational Romani activists and professional elite has emerged, but an educated Roma middle class that could serve as the backbone of an autonomous Roma civil society is hardly perceptible. The cosmopolitanism of Roma appears to be the class consciousness of the minuscule frequent traveler Roma elite. In reality, most Roma cultivate loyalty to the state in which they live, as well to the specific alleged Roma subculture they belong to. The majority of Roma cannot afford to travel abroad or even to visit the capital city of the country. Theoretical lessons, because this was, the paper is published in a volume about global civil society. So one conclusion is actually global civil society is often perceived as something reacting to, let's say, neoliberal globalization and the hegemony of the USA. In the case of Roma, it's actually the opposite. So many people identify it with American influence and the influence of American donors and foundations, but this is changing. It is also not true that these actors are outside state mechanisms, because they precisely target states. And at the same time, yes, the democratic credentials of these actors are often questioned. If you know that, yes, there are these World Roma Congresses where it's doubtful who are delegated, but from every corner of the world Roma people come and they decide on things. It's true that they have poor legitimacy, but actually their main message cannot be dismissed. Roma are second-class citizens in their home country and within the EU. So what is the final conclusion? Roma are second-class citizens in their home countries and within the EU. They are not equal before the law, as their human dignity and fundamental rights are violated on a daily basis without any sanctions. They are not equal members of the political community, as their values and interests are not represented at either local, national, or international level. And the noble principle of equally motivated and gifted Roma having the same chance of realizing her life plans as non-Roma remains a utopia. At the same time, these actors that most of the time have very beneficial and positive roles, what we call pro-Roma global civil society, plays a crucial role, but it can easily turn hegemonic, and replacing or outweighting Roma activists is counterproductive. It can only result in the further marginalization and demonization of Roma. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Now we are more and more linked to politics, to real life, to say. So questions and comment. The eterno și fascinantul. Yeah, please.
Thank you for describing the
simple question. I mean, it is true that actually this money is usually it was coming from outside the state, and this is what private actors recognized. That the NGOs who want to do something for the Roma, they were not originally funded by the usual ways, and they didn't have a membership. And that's when the private actors, in particular the Soros Foundation, came in to the picture, and they helped to raise an important funder of this civil society. But at the same time, now there are articles that it's true that the incentives and the funding, if it's exclusively coming from outside, it can contribute to the demobilization of Roma. So I think that's one important critique. But it's maybe a bit unrealistic to expect real Roma grassroots organization. I mean, it is true, but there is no, the wealthy layer that could finance it is very thin, I think, in most of the countries. But it's a complex issue. So I tend to agree with those that it's not good if you have only external incentives and financial incentives.
Other questions? Please.
How do you see the role of European Roma Travelers Forum, because it's an international NGO with representation from all these European Commission countries, Council of Europe countries?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think it's an achievement in a way. If you followed it, because the International Romani Union is, to be honest, it's a bit chaotic. Who is a delegate? Who is getting there? I was in the World Roma Congress as an observer in 2008, and I could see that it's not very clear who is representing whom. And they try to create a body. I don't know how many of you know the European Roma Traveler Forum, that is representative, and that is bringing together all the European Roma and travelers under the auspices of the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is a quite weak international organization, but they have to create this organization. And each country has a delegate, kind of an umbrella organization that is supposed to represent the Roma there. And they made, it is still not working perfectly as far as I can see, but it's an important step. The only problem is that it is created as a consultative body to this very big organization, the Council of Europe, which is not, it has nothing to do with the European Union, it's a different organization, much bigger. And actually I'm writing about this in another paper, that they were left out of the most important developments, the EU Roma Framework Strategy. So now it seems that the EU will give a lot of money and energy to all these national efforts. But the European Roma Traveler Forum was kind of excluded. Even as far as I know, they made efforts. The European Union contracted an NGO based in Brussels, the European Roma Information Office, which is a very small advocacy NGO, which is not representing anybody. And so I think this forum has a lot of potentials, but it's not used by the European Union and other countries, and it's a pity. And of course it can, I know that it's the delegation of candidates is also sometimes not very clear and democratic, but it could be an important organization.
Other questions? Well, if not, please. Last minute.
Connection between the national and the international levels of different NGOs. Because I would like to know if you could find portrait or something like this, which could be coherent.
Well, there are, I think in Romania and in every country there are a lot of NGOs that have a national focus, or even local. But they usually, I think, link up with the big so-called international NGOs that have a rate. So if you have, for example, now in Cluj, or I don't know, but I know that there are very urgent situations in the Patarat community or in Romania as well, then they can link up with more powerful NGOs like the Amnesty International or the Roma Rights Centre, and and they can help them to bring it to the international sphere, and then they can have international pressure on, let's say, the local government. So they have a very complex cooperation. They have a kind of a division of work.
Yes, but how do you explain that you have in Budapest Roma Information Center, which location is more international, and do exist others like this? Other cores of the international NGO organization?
Yeah. So one is in Budapest, the European Roma Rights Centre. In Brussels, you have the European Roma Information Office. They are clearly international. And then you have the involvement of big human rights NGOs like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. They are doing this it's true that it's very abstract advocacy what they do. They go to the European United Nations and they lobby there. It's a bit, yeah. The problem is that at the same time, I think it's a good thing that we have these NGOs. The problem is that on a grassroots level and national level, they are not strong enough, and there are a lot of problems.
You mentioned the social psychological factor, referring still about the Romas, because you said that your paper is referring to the global civil society and less about Roma. But still, when you said that the Romas are fragmented and stigmatized and they are second-class citizens, I am very curious about the category of Romas that are well positioned. I don't know how to formulate this properly. That are rich, the palaces, I don't know, like this kind of the leaders of the organizations sometimes are really powerful persons, and they are the guys that are defending the Roma human rights. But from the position, so they complain about the grassroots not having this and not having that, but they kind of have a lot. And I'm very interesting. They are not taken into consideration. I don't know the percentage, but this category is still a reference. We know about the Roma palaces or fortune. What role these guys are playing together with their fortune?
Yeah. I think they are present in different forums. So I know that some of them claim to be the traditional leaders, like Buribas or Vajda, and they say that this is their status, and actually sometimes even the national agencies recognize them, that you are a local leader. I know that in Hungary, Romania, you have also the king, the emperor, and maybe, yes, but of all the Roma of the world. But it's very interesting that Florin Csoba is also the vice president of the European Roma and Traveller Forum. So they are present in different forums, and they are also in the city local government. But he wasn't elected to the Romanian parliament. I mean, they are there. So it is one criticism in the literature that they organize associations that are based on family structure, they favor family members, and that this is a big problem of the Roma civil society. So I think they can be criticized for also not running efficient NGOs enough.
I have a question about the NGOs you analyzed. You were saying that they didn't have enough impact. Did you analyze only NGOs that have a focus on Roma communities, or all kind of NGOs that you can, I don't know, aim at local development and address Roma communities as well?
No, it was those NGOs that specifically claim to do something for the Roma.
But by the way, it links to the title, umbrella title of this panel. Do you think that in policy terms, not social, anthropo, whatever, in policy terms, do you think that in this period, next period, with multicultural being dead, focusing just and only on Roma advocacy networks is a good policy or not? You see what I mean? I think, this is my feeling, that the context is changing, then it's changing, and that in this case, I'm wondering, and I'm not a political scientist, but I'm wondering if as strategies, advocacy strategy, having a network just of and for Roma issue is still the best possible strategy, in political terms.
It's a big question, but I mean, what we can see, and now it's not only Eastern Europe, but Western Europe, is pressure rise from outside. And this is what many NGOs, even Roma or pro-Roma, can do. So they cannot, if you are in France, it's easier to pressurize the French government not to deport immigrant Roma through the European Union. Of course, many people can argue that until you have really coming from, let's say, the Romanian society, let's say a multicultural or a different conception of citizenship, it cannot work, because you cannot impose from outside that now, let's say in the next 10 years you will integrate Roma, whatever it means. It's, I think this is the biggest disadvantage, that you want to have, you can have leverage from the outside, but these projects are often felt as exposed from outside. And in Hungary we have a lot of experience with this, so we launched so-called desegregation program in schools, where the schools received incentives to have Roma and non-Roma children together. But then when the sociologists researched it, they coined the term that this is called integration. Yes, they have incentive to be together, but the parents are not happy. And actually they continue to bring their children to white schools. So I have to agree that whatever concept of citizenship or concept of social integration we have, it must have roots in the local level, otherwise it will not work. The same with Judith wrote an excellent paper on a settlement, let's say, restructuration plan, where they demolished the Roma slum that was next to the village, but maybe it's better if you say it, and they put the Roma population inside the village, into decent houses, which was a kind of an external project, but of course the non-Roma population wasn't happy, and they were shocked. I don't know, that the Roma went. They started to live in the village center, and they started to leave the village. And what was the result of this project with a lot of money? That's gradually the whole village became a ghetto village, a Roma village. So if you don't have the local roots of, you accept the diversity and you want to live together and you can live together and you want to go to the same school, it will never work, I think.
Okay, thank you. Thinking about my